Update, my parents, who I was paying rent to, told me to move out but still keep paying so my brother, their favorite, could take my place. I left the next day and cut all contact and now they won't stop calling, saying I'm the worst daughter ever because they can't afford their mortgage anymore. Part 2. When I saw them, my mom started to cry and my dad, in an angry yet sad voice, began to berate me, calling me the worst daughter ever for abandoning them in their time of need and not helping them financially when I could have. They were actually at my grandparents' house to ask for money because, after I stopped paying rent, they were facing difficulties paying their mortgage. My grandparents were willing to listen to them but decided against it after they saw my parents blaming me for everything. My grandpa lost it and told my father that he had been a terrible parent to me since my childhood because he expected too much of me. He let my father know how everyone in our extended family pitied me because of how I was treated as a child. My parents tried to argue back but were quickly shut down when reminded of how they kicked me out to have their good-for-nothing son Brad back, who somehow wasn't a liability to them, but I was. My grandfather then broke the news to them. He had decided to give me my parents' share of the property in his will. My parents' jaws dropped, and realizing they had no other option, they began shedding crocodile tears, trying to convince my grandma to give them back their share. She reminded them that karma hit them for what they did to me and that she had no regrets. My parents began begging me to convince my grandparents, but they never apologized for their nasty comments, expecting me to treat them nicely because they were family. Seeing how hard my grandparents fought for me, I grew a spine and told them they didn't deserve a kid like me and maybe they could expect funds from their golden child, whose life they chose to destroy. It got extremely quiet, and then they began screaming at me, calling me names, and wishing I was never born. My grandparents had had enough and asked them to leave before the cops were called. My parents left all flustered. I began to cry and thank my grandparents for being my actual parents, saying I didn't wish for their money after all they had done for me. They told me they had made up their minds long ago when they saw how selfish my parents were. They had also saved some money for Brad, but it was inaccessible to my parents. They advised me not to worry about it and to focus on my future, which I did. I had applied to a few colleges and got accepted into the best one. After deliberating with my grandparents, who insisted on paying my tuition, I agreed. I was going to leave in a month when the session began. About my parents and Brad, I hadn't heard from them so far and was glad things were working out because it was the first time I felt fully confident in myself. I was happy I had cut contact with them because toxic people do make your life miserable. Update 1. Since the last update, I hadn't heard from my family until one day I received an email from Brad. He mentioned he didn't have my number and wanted to meet me once to talk. At first, I was hesitant because we never really had a relationship, but I reminded myself that I had my grandparents with me and agreed to meet him for lunch at a local cafe. I arrived at the location before Brad and was contemplating leaving when he showed up, looking tired and with stubble. The first few minutes were awkward, but I decided to initiate the conversation. Brad shared that the house was a mess since my parents found out we weren't getting anything from our grandparents. For the first few days, the blame was on me, then it shifted to them fighting each other. Brad, who was going through a tough divorce, had left the house and stayed at a friend's. The day before he visited home, he saw the house was filthy and both parents were day drinking. Brad cleaned the house, but my parents said it wasn't necessary as they would lose it soon due to inability to pay the mortgage. I felt awkward hearing this because I had been through worse situations because of my parents and sometimes Brad. I didn't want to sound unsympathetic, so I nodded. Brad thought I was sympathizing with him and continued talking, revealing he had secretly met his ex-wife a few months ago, and she was now pregnant and wanted to rekindle their relationship. He asked if I could share some of my portion of the inheritance with our parents and him so they could get their lives together, and he could start fresh with his upcoming parenthood. I couldn't believe his audacity. I thought he needed someone to talk to, but he was actually there for money. I lost it and decided to be petty. I reminded him that no one was there for me my whole life and that he stood quietly when my parents kicked me out. I told him not to disgrace the word family with his shameless request for money. I also mentioned that it was our parents who were the reason for his divorce due to their interference. Before he could respond, I left money for my portion of the order and walked out. I went back to my grandparents' house, told them everything, and they said they thought Brad was different, but as they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Now you can watch the third part by pressing share and more.